What's up, guys? My name is Mr. Bruce, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into 3 of the very best true crime stories, each one with disturbing backstories. I'd really appreciate if you take a look at all 3 stories because each one is extremely strong and very memorable. And as always, if you enjoy dark storytelling and true crime, then you've come to the right place because that's our thing. So I would really appreciate if you would consider hitting the like button right now and subscribing to the channel for more stories just like this. And with that, let's get into it. On September 7th of 1988, a quiet Long Island, New York neighborhood erupted in terror. 17-year-old Martin Tankleff woke up to a nightmare that would completely change the course of his life and baffle investigators as well as crime enthusiasts for decades to come. Inside his family's home in the Belle Torre neighborhood, he discovered his adopted parents Seymour and Arlene Tankleff had been brutally attacked. His mother Arlene had been stabbed and beaten and passed away. His father Seymour was found critically injured but barely alive. Although Seymour initially survived, he passed away in the hospital just weeks later from his injuries. For most people, finding their parents murdered would make them the victim of an unimaginable tragedy. But for Martin Tankleff, it would mark the beginning of a life path that was far more shocking. Because before investigators had found the person responsible, they started looking at him. Martin's parents, Seymour and Arlene, were caring and loving people, having adopted Martin out of the goodness of their hearts to give him a better life. At the time of the incident, Martin was just 17 years old. He was a high school student preparing for college, and by all accounts, he had a pretty normal relationship with his parents, so there was no obvious motive for him as an attacker, and there was no physical evidence directly connecting him to the murders in any way. But as detectives investigated the case, their focus quickly shifted towards Martin. During questioning, investigators began suggesting that they believed Martin was responsible. Martin, of course, completely denied it, saying there was absolutely no way. But here's where things start to get a little twisted. During the interrogation, the detectives told Martin that they had evidence against him, telling him that his father had regained consciousness and identified Martin as the attacker. It was a bold-faced lie, because Seymour Tankleff would never end up regaining consciousness, and weeks later he would pass away, something that Martin didn't know. After hours of questioning and assuming that police were telling him the truth, Martin became confused and began questioning his own memory. He reportedly wondered if he could have somehow blacked out and committed the murders without remembering. But he posed this more as a question of possibility rather than a statement of what actually happened. Eventually, investigators would take these vague statements and call it a confession to the murder. But there were still some major glaring problems with it. He did not sign the confession statements, the interrogation was not recorded, and Martin quickly denied that he had murdered his parents. It seemed like another example of an interrogation where the suspect was tricked into saying something that could look bad if it were taken out of context. Despite those concerns, prosecutors moved forward with the case. In 1990, Martin Tankleff was convicted of murdering Seymour and Arlene Tankleff, his parents, and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. A teenager who had discovered his parents' bodies was now behind bars, convicted of killing them. But Martin never stopped fighting, and friends of his parents, innocent advocates, lawyers, and people that knew him, well, they believed him. While in prison, he and his team of lawyers, investigators, and supporters spent years examining the original investigation. They argued that detectives had focused too heavily on Martin while ignoring other possible suspects and evidence. Their appeals highlighted problems with the interrogation, the lack of physical evidence, and information they believed pointed towards other people. Eventually, new information began to emerge. One person the initial investigators did look at and quickly dismiss was Jerry Stuerman, a business associate of Martin's father. Seymour Tankleff and Stuerman had been involved in business together, Investigators later learned there may have been financial disputes between them. Some reports suggest that Stuerman owed Seymour hundreds of thousands of dollars, creating a possible motive. This, however, is just skimming the surface into Stuerman's suspicious activities. After the murder, Stuerman did something that was one of the more bizarre parts of the entire case. He withdrew money from a joint account that he shared with Seymour. He staged his own death and fled to California, changed his appearance, shaving his beard and altering his hair, and eventually found living in California under an alias. Defense investigators argued that his actions and possible motives deserved a much closer look. The investigation became even more convoluted when a witness, Glenn Harris, came forward with a secret that he was keeping for the last 14 years. He claimed he drove two men to the Tankleff home the night of the murder, but this was unsubstantiated as Glenn Harris was a career criminal who was currently serving time. So his story seems a bit implausible. Nonetheless, the names of the individuals that he named are Peter Kent and Joseph Creedon. The defense argued these leads should have been investigated years earlier, and that the original investigation focused too narrowly on Martin while overlooking other possibilities. After nearly 17 years in prison, Martin Tankleff finally got the break that he has spent his life fighting for. In 2007, his conviction was overturned, and he was released. But the story doesn't end quite there. Martin followed up his release with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for wrongful conviction and received just north of $13 million. The teenager who had once been accused of killing his own parents eventually turned his experience into a new mission. He went on to go to law school. He earned his law degree and dedicated his life to criminal defense and wrongful convictions. He is a full-fledged lawyer. But while Martin was free, the case itself remained unsolved. No one was ever convicted for the murder of Seymour and Arlene Tankleff. The case itself remains one of the most controversial wrongful conviction cases in American true crime history. The bigger mystery isn't just how a teenager ended up behind bars, but how a killer was never caught. The thrill kill. He was careful about who he rented to. That was something 53-year-old Al Kites had learned over time. Al lived alone in a quiet townhouse in the foothills of beautiful Aurora, Colorado. And to help with expenses, he rented out a spare room in his home. But Al wasn't careless about who he chose. He would ask questions, run background checks, and most importantly, trust his instincts before letting a stranger move in. He wasn't the type of person that would simply open his door to anyone who showed interest. However, in the spring of 2004, Al would make a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. Al placed in advertisements looking for someone to rent the room, and eventually he received a response from a man calling himself Robert Cooper. At first glance, everything seemed completely normal. Cooper was polite, soft-spoken, and appeared to be an easygoing person who would make an ideal tenant. There was also another little detail that made the arrangement seem even more appealing. Cooper was willing to pay in cash. Al invited him over, showed him around the townhouse, allowing him inside of his home. But what happened after that meeting would not be discovered until days later. By then, the person responsible had already done something that few criminals managed to do. He committed a brutal crime and disappeared without leaving behind a clear trail. On May 25th of 2004, Al Kite failed to show up for work. For someone who is known to be reliable, this immediately raised concerns. When co-workers tried contacting him and couldn't get a response, they eventually called police, who went to his townhouse for a welfare check. Inside of the home, investigators discovered Al in the basement. He had been murdered in a brutal and deliberate attack. Detectives determined that he had been restrained and subjected to a prolonged assault before his death. The injuries showed that it was not a random act of violence. Whoever was responsible had taken control of the situation and carried out an attack with a disturbing level of planning and patience. From the beginning, investigators knew that this was not a simple burglary that had gone wrong. this was something much more calculated. The crime scene suggested that the killer had arrived prepared, brought what they needed to carry out the attack, and left in a way that was designed to avoid detection. The person responsible was not acting in a moment of panic. They appeared to know exactly what they were doing. But perhaps one of the most unsettling parts of the entire crime scene was not what investigators found, but what they didn't find. There was no useful fingerprints at the scene, no clear DNA evidence that they could use to identify the killer, and no obvious path that would lead them to a suspect. Whoever killed Al appeared to have taken steps to remove evidence, gathering up anything that could connect them to the crime, because he left behind almost nothing. After the murder, several of Al's belongings were missing, including his wallet, credit cards, cell phone, and even his truck. The stolen cards were later used at ATMs. The locations of these ATMs were scattered and random, with no pattern. And although the ATM surveillance cameras captured images of the person using them, his face was obstructed. The man in those images was the same person who had introduced himself as Robert Cooper, but detectives soon discovered something that changed the direction of the investigation. Robert Cooper was not his real name. It was an alias. Robert Cooper didn't exist. Using surveillance footage and witness accounts, investigators created a composite sketch of the suspect. But the image showed a man without many distinctive features, and despite the attention surrounding the case, detectives were unable to determine his true identity. As investigators continued examining the evidence, one disturbing possibility became even harder to ignore. This did not appear to be the work of someone who acted impulsively. The preparation, the restraint, the cleanup, and the absence of forensic evidence suggested someone who understood how investigations worked and knew how to avoid leaving behind any clues. The FBI would eventually become involved, which is unusual for a single victim homicide case. Their concern was that the person responsible may have committed other crimes before this attack and may have continued afterward. But connecting possible links to other crimes as well as solving this crime has proven nearly impossible because of the lack of evidence, no clear motive, as well as meticulous planning and attention to detail. The media covering the incident would dub the crime as a thrill kill. Whether Robert Cooper was a serial offender or just someone who committed one carefully planned attack remains unknown. What investigators do know is that the culprit was patient, organized, and extremely calculated. Perhaps one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case is that someone walked into Al Kite's home using a fake name, committed an unimaginable crime, and then vanished. More than 2 decades later, the identity of Robert Cooper remains unknown. On January 6 of 1999, crew members aboard the tugboat called the Elk, which was stationed on the Vistula River, made a horrifying discovery. While working the river, the boat's propeller had become entangled. What they found on the propeller were the remains of human skin. Not body parts, not a human body, just the skin. Katarzyna Zowada was a 23-year-old university student living in Krakow, Poland. By all accounts, she was quiet and private, someone who enjoyed reading and spending time alone. But in late 1998, she disappeared, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. On November 12th of 1998, Katarzyna was supposed to attend classes at Jagiellonian University, one of Poland's oldest and most prestigious universities. But she never showed up. Her family quickly realized that something was wrong, and the search began. At first, there was little evidence. No clear suspect, and no obvious motive. No explanation for why a young woman had vanished. As the months passed, things were looking pretty hopeless. Then, investigators made a discovery in the Vistula River that turned the case into one of the strangest and most disturbing crimes in Polish history. In early January of 1999, the human skin was found in the propeller in the Vistula River. For Forensic testing revealed that the skin had been meticulously dissected from the body and prepared and tailored in such a way that it was crafted into a form resembling a piece of clothing, such as a vest. The remains belonged to Katarzyna. Over the next few days, portions of her dismembered body were found scattered in different spots along the river. She had been dismembered and decapitated. In a cruel twist, investigators determined that her cause of death was exsanguination or severe blood loss, which indicated that she had been subjected to torture prior to her death. It was a detail so bizarre and disturbing that it immediately drew national attention. This was no longer a regular murder investigation. Investigators were now trying to find out what type of person would even commit such a crime and why they would go to such lengths. The evidence suggested the killer had planned the crime carefully. The condition of the remains indicated that Katarzyna had likely been murdered before being placed in the river, and investigators believe the killer may have had knowledge of anatomy or human biology. But despite the unusual nature of the crime, investigators struggled to find answers. For years, the case remained unsolved. There were theories, sure, but no real suspects and countless questions, and no one that could explain exactly what happened to Katarzyna and why she was targeted. One of the challenges was that there appeared to be very little connection between Katarzyna and whoever killed her. There was no obvious motive, no confirmed eyewitnesses, and no clear trail leading back to any type of suspect. Another small detail about her disappearance became evident on November 12th of 1998 when she failed to meet her mother at a psychiatric clinic in Nowa Huta, Krakow, where she had been receiving treatment. The investigation went cold and eventually became one of Poland's most famous cold cases. But nearly 2 decades later, investigators reopened the case and began to take another look at old evidence using modern forensic techniques. In 2017, almost 20 years later, police arrested a man named Robert Zawinski. Investigators believed that they had finally found the person responsible for Katarzyna's murder. According to prosecutors, evidence pointed towards him as the person who killed her and mutilated her body. They found blood and hair in his bathroom. They then alleged that he had developed a disturbing obsession with death and violence before committing the crime that had remained unsolved for nearly 20 years. However, the case remained controversial and questions surrounding the evidence and investigation continued. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, and the legal process became complicated. Although he was convicted, 6 years later it was overruled and he was released. The murder of Katarzyna Zowada remains one of the most unsettling crimes in Poland, not only because of the shocking discovery that investigators made, but because for years a young woman disappeared without a trace, leaving family members without answers. For nearly 3 decades, the case continues to fascinate investigators as well as true crime followers because it represents one of the most disturbing mysteries, a crime with an unbelievable discovery, a lengthy investigation, and questions that remain unanswered for far too long. The case remains unsolved. That's going to do it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the story because I enjoyed making them. Thanks for tuning in. And if you haven't already, do me a favor and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel because that really helps us a lot. And also take a look around. We got a whole lot more stories just like this, and I really think you'll enjoy watching some of the other videos that we have. That's it for now. See ya.